So Ercilia Sahores, Ercilia Sahores is with us. She's a founding member and Latin America Director of Regeneration International. She's also a campaign director for the Mexico-based Association of Organic Consumers and works with Via Orgánica in San Miguel de Allende. She has more than 15 years of experience campaigning and organizing experience in low-income communities and rural areas. So we're pleased to have her. Ercilia, please.
Thank you, everybody. And I have to say that formerly, and before I started working with ARAI and at Via Orgánica, I was part of the Center for Global Justice for many years. So it's always a pleasure for me to come back and to be able to see all these familiar faces. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone who is joining us online. Can you hear us well? Yes, looks like we can. So if you bear with me for a second, I'm going to share my screen. I don't really love PowerPoint presentations, but this is here. It's a little bit of a challenge because it's mostly in Spanish, but I'm going to say it in English. I'm not even going to read it because as I mentioned before, doing PowerPoint presentations can be kind of too much, especially after this time of pandemics. Roberto was reminding us about, how things have changed and what a challenge we faced back in 2020. But I think that for many of us, it was a challenge, but also a big opportunity. I think everyone has a personal story of 2020 and COVID times, some of them very difficult, but for others, it was also a period of transformation. Many of us changed the way we lived, our pace, our lives. In my case, personally, I was living between Mexico City, where I do a lot of the political work for the Organic Consumers Association and Regeneration International, and even our affiliate organization here in San Miguel de Allende, which is Via Orgánica. So most of my time was Mexico City, a bit of my time was here in San Miguel, in particular at the Via Orgánica ranch on the way to Jalpa. I don't know how many of you have been, if you guys could raise your hands, I would bet, there's more that are looking at us online who have been there. So this is like a farm school located in the outskirts of San Miguel de Allende, where we do a lot of showing processes of how to grow your own food, how to be more biodiverse, how to be more regenerative, which is a term I'm going to go in a second. But going back to this personal and transformative experience back in 2020, I realized it was a good opportunity for me to actually be back at a ranch and live there. And I didn't really change that. So for the past 3 years, I've been living at the ranch, and that change in life has been very transformative in the way that I face also the work I do. So if we reflect back of what it meant to have a place where you could grow your own food, where you had a community surrounding you, where you had a safe space back in 2020, I think that for many of us, we realized that that's really the way to move forward. That's the way to go. That's a way to understand that we need to go back to these like local bioregions, biodistricts, and start realizing the impact that has the way we eat, the way we grow our food, and also the way we relate to others. And that has to do with these principles of regeneration. So for many, many years, at least in Latin America, for about 3-4 decades, we've been talking about agroecology. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with the term agroecology, but it's like a movement, political movement, but also a movement of growing your own food, which started in Latin America back in the 60s. So way before the Green Revolution even started, people were already looking at, okay, so how do we do short circuits in terms of growing our own food and exchanging our own food? Started to think about the idea of food sovereignty, food sustainability, growing and exchanging. So this is kind of a movement that was here before the idea of regeneration started. And when I discuss this idea of regeneration, I would say that it only has 8 to 10 years. So now, what's one of the PAM terms that we hear all the time in the press, UN, conferences like the COP summits or the biodiversity summits or the desertification summits? Everyone is talking about regeneration. What does regeneration really mean? And what's the danger of everyone talking about regeneration? So in order to understand something, it's important to define it. I mean, we're not just going to start by defining regeneration, that's going to be all that we do, but starting to think about what was important in terms of looking at regeneration. And many years ago, like, in the 2010s, people were talking about sustainability. So one of the words that was the popular word in the UN sphere was sustainability. So the sustainable decade, right? When we had all these ideas of the 20 sustainable steps or how to be more sustainable, we started realizing that the idea of sustainability was everywhere and that the word sustainability was being so used that it was actually being co-opted by these, large corporations or large organizations. So we came up with another idea of starting to talk about regeneration and talking about regeneration as a global umbrella term that would actually fit different practices, different movements, and different principles. So it could be one common language, this idea of a common language, a common word, a common term that would actually create bridges instead of dividing. Instead of talking, agroecology on the one side, permaculture on the other side, regeneration on the other side, biodynamic on the other side, how can we come with a common term, a common language that would embrace all of these movements, that would embrace all of these different definitions, and would actually let us move forward instead of what we often do as human beings, work in silos and fight against each other. So this is a very short intro that I'm going to go do about regeneration, because what I want to do is actually talk about solutions and not talk about the crisis that we're facing, because I think that we're all fed up with this idea of there's climate crisis, there's nothing we can do, we got only 5 years, which we do, but if we start looking at the solutions, number one, I feel that it's more compelling of a story. Number two, I think that it brings us some optimism. And number three, it makes us move to action instead of, this idea of being frozen and paralyzed by the idea of apocalypse now or in 5 years. So we started discussing regeneration, and back in 2015, there was a big, it was actually the Climate Week in New York City. Climate Week is starting today, in New York City. But back in 2015, it was one of the first climate weeks, and they serve sort of as the gateway or the first meeting of the year before the Conference of the Parties, which usually happens in November and December. As you know, the Conference of the Parties is part of the global arena of the UN summits related to food, related to climate crisis and agriculture. There's three main ones. One is the Conference of the Parties, related more to climate crisis and solutions. Number two is the UN Conference on Biodiversity. And number three is the UN Conference about or Convention to Combat Desertification. If you ask me, why can't we have a summit that includes desertification, biodiversity, and climate crisis, just one? I have no idea why. I assume that's because they are, the more bureaucracy that they create, the better it is. But it really makes it difficult because most of the bodies that govern the part of the certification, biodiversity and climate crisis, don't talk with each other. It's kind of when we look at governments and you got health on the one side and you got finance or production or economy on the other side, and then you got agriculture on the other side, and there's usually not a lot of relationship among these secretaries or ministries. So that's another big issue that we need to work on. So back in 2015, we were at the Climate Week in New York City, and we started noticing as we were marching that part of the movement was there, but it was not necessarily aligned. So we had the consumer side on the one hand, we had the producers and the farmers on the other side, we had the soil scientists and academia on the other side, we had the whole movement for health right to health, medicine, alternative medicine as well. But these were, again, as I mentioned before, working in silos, not communicating, not connecting. So all of a sudden, there was a decision of, well, what should we do to really affect change? How can we be more powerful? How can we start connecting? So this is a little bit of how the genesis of Regeneration International. So in 2015, in December, in one of these conferences of the parties in the UN, we all sat in Paris on the same table and decided that it was about time we started a global movement. So from those, 5 to 6 people that sat at the table, one of them, our late Ronnie Cummins was there, Vandana Shiva, Hans Herren, several people that are actually part of a global movement and have a network of networks within their reach and within their power, decided to get started. So in 2016, we decided to make this big noise, had a foundational meeting in Costa Rica with over 60 people from 60 different organizations representing all these different parts of the whole spectrum that I mentioned before. And we started Regeneration International. So RI has grown, and now we have about 520 organizations that are part of this global movement. Across the world, we have an international coordinator in Africa, another one in Australia, in Europe, in North America, and in Latin America. So what do we do? Concrete words. We look for solutions, proven on the ground, technical solutions to change this. And what is this? When we look at a climate crisis
and learning.
The climate change, I would like to call it crisis climate change. We can discuss that as well. When we look at that, usually agriculture is being pointed as the main problem that affects climate change. One of the biggest contributors, if you wish, to the climate crisis. And why is that? Well, if you don't take things in isolation, if you look at this graph basically shows you how the agro-industrial system or conventional agriculture is responsible for greenhouse gas effects. So usually people think about, well, it's only say 11 to 15%, because that's the part where we're talking about industrial production on the ground, right at the farm. And I'm talking about, pesticides, fuel, everything that has to do with chemicals
donations through our website.
Fuel contribution. There's also other parts that have to do with GHG and do one in one way or the other represent the whole part of agriculture from the ground all the way to where you place the food. Our
Regenerative agriculture.
Because there's some chats here. Yeah.
Okay. Many of you already.
If you look at that, there's a what if you produce at the farm level, it's 11 to 15%.
Basically,
nutrition saying that here's someone else.
Our system, and the presentation of Ercilia with that.
But he's not talking.
However, in addition to being indicated, the cost of the cover.
Okay, somebody else.
Yeah, Caroline. Yeah.
It's Roberto's introduction coming alive. Okay.
Y esa marquita allá que se ve
como un micrófono, ¿no?
You're not muted on.
No.
Maybe you need to talk into them.
Okay, no, it's somebody else, someone in particular having this trouble. Can you?
Go ahead.
Okay, so let's go ahead and continue with this. So we look at this chart. We have everything that has to do from farm production. So how you grow your own lettuce and how many pesticides you put and how much gas you expend. And if you have a ranch that has cows, it's also the manure and the methane and et cetera, et cetera. But also the change of land use and deforestation. That accounts for about 15 to 18% of global emissions. And the change of land use and deforestation was very simple. We see it as we write in rural areas here in Mexico. It's, places where we used to have lots of trees, lots of vegetation, and then all of a sudden they've been cut off in order to be able to grow food. And it's very evident when you drive to places like Los Rodriguez. I know that many of you are familiar with the cooperative of Peñón de Baños. You've seen that road over there. We see it more and more where we live at, also on the way to Cuapa and other places as well. Where I'm from South America. Change of land use and deforestation has been evident in all the central part of Argentina, parts of Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay as well. Basically, to grow soy and also for cattle. So, and then there's that other part, which is transportation, packaging. I mean, the absurd idea of packaging we see nowadays. If you go to a supermarket aisle where bananas come with, wrapped in plastics. And then waste. It's very important also to consider the waste. When we talk about food shortages or not enough food being produced, which was one of the biggest claims of the Green Revolution, is it true? Is that what happens? We're not producing enough food. Actually, Latin America, we grow more food than we could eat. Most of that food, though, it's being exported to other places in the world. And what we are left with here is junk food. I mean, I look at the exchange between the US and Mexico, for instance. Mexico is one of the largest importers of organic food. Most of it goes to the US. What do we get from the US? Go to any tiendita de barrotes and we'll realize. So I know you guys know all of this. So I'm gonna go very fast through all of these things, but basically we realized that the idea was, well, what are we gonna do? We need to change the way we're producing. Industrial agriculture, conventional agriculture, as it is now, can no longer perpetuate, can no longer continue. Otherwise, apocalypse now will be in 2 months. So we need to put carbon back to where it belongs. Where does it belong? Yeah, that's right. Exactly. It's a sponge, it's the ground, it's the soil. It belongs all there by a very natural, obvious process that we all learned when we were 7, 8 in school, photosynthesis. Remember that guy? Yeah. So let's bring it back to the soil. Soil is the largest sponge. Oceans as well, but they're so acidified that they can no longer process all of that. So basically, natural regenerative agriculture works with nature, follows the processes of nature. And what it does is that it uses photosynthesis and soil biology. It extracts greenhouse gas effects and it brings them from the air where they shouldn't be, back to the soil, back to the ground. It recreates and regenerates the soil. And by regenerating the soil, we create more highly nutritious food, kind of like the food we used to eat back in the day, where a tomato tasted like a tomato and an apple tasted like an apple. And meat was really good. Sorry if there's some vegetarian in the room, but I'm Argentinian, so I can't help you. There's all these different, so many studies have been done. How much carbon can we actually put back in the soil? People say, it's like it could be 4,000 million that we can put in, acres. I don't know about acres and hectares. I always get those wrong. But the thing is, some people talk about 4,000 million. Some people talk about more. Hola, Julie. But the truth of the matter is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it could be 1,000, if it could be 4,000, whatever it could be. What matters is that we need to start now. We need to get started, and we cannot continue with this, ridiculous conversations about how much can it be possible, how deep can we store the carbon on the ground. It's like solutions are already out there. Let's start looking at what people are doing and how they are doing that. So regenerative practices that are there and people are already implementing have to do with this idea of minimal disturbance. So there's different practices, as I mentioned before. There's agroforestry, there's 0 to minimum tillage. There's this idea of always have a green cover, always cover your ground, never leave it bare. Silvopasture, composting, holistic management, holistic rotational grazing, some things that if you guys have been, to any regenerative or ecological ranch, you've seen. If you go to Biorgánica, if you go to Ata's place at Sosnavar, you'll see some of those practices being implemented as well, which is just fantastic. So a couple of principles, because it's not all just practices. Practices are very important, but if there are no principles, it's just, a mechanical, automatic thing that we're doing. Principles is this idea of diversity. So for us, it's very important that diversity exists. And when I say diversity, I talk in terms of biology, biodiversity, ecosystems, but diversity in all sorts. Diversity also when we're talking about people, about population, about animals, about, the more the merrier. And it makes it more resilient. We usually talk about resilience as the capability that beings or that ecosystem has to sort of recover from a stress. And going back to COVID, we could see that the people that could thrive and they were better off during COVID and were more resilient were communities that were more diverse and full of biodiversity. The law of return versus the law of extraction, what does this imply? I mean, agriculture shouldn't be take, which is this model of, agro-conventional agro-industry. You need to give back. I mean, Mother Earth is not going to continue, giving by just us putting, nitrogen and fertilizers and forcing her to do that, kind of having her on steroids or drugs and making her, produce. We need to actually return and give back more than what we take. And then this idea of the commons, that's an idea of regeneration, principle of regeneration, which is that everything that I do, one way or the other, affects the other people. It's kind of living upstream, how they say, whatever you do up the stream affects whomever lives downstream. So we could go on talking about this idea of regeneration and what we do, which is basically connecting farmers, social movements, activists, environmentalists, to change local economies to improve livelihoods, but also to affect public policy. Because a big thing of what we do is linked to this idea of our ecology. We're not just about principles and practices, which we're all about that, but it's also about pushing public policy and having an impact on the agenda. So we have to go to some of these conventions and big conferences like the Conference of the Parties, but we also need to act locally. And so one of the things that I would like to invite you to do, and I will share this with Lisa and Roberto so they can share it with the rest of the network, is we're planning a People's Food Summit, which is October the 16th. This is going to be our third edition of the People's Food Summit. We're going to be portraying the real farmers, the real growers, people that produce the food that we eat and telling their stories. And we're also planning to do an alternative COP. So a Conference of the Parties, but it's going to be alternative and it's going to be localized. So we really think that the future is to start thinking about bioregions, to start thinking about biodistricts. And San Miguel, for instance, has a big potential. Places like the Cuenca de Jalpa and other places as well have the opportunity to be a center of connection of traditions, of produce, and of biodiversity as well. So I'm going to invite you all also to attend to that. That's going to be in December. And again, we could continue talking about, bad news, like this idea of planetary boundaries and how we are in red in most of our 9 planetary boundaries, and how the risk of, if we continue down the same path, the risk for us to suffer more and more of storms, which we're already suffering, floods. I mean, we also, what happened this weekend in Libya, that was an atrocity, and it just reminds us of, so many things that we're seeing all the time, and it's becoming more and more frequent. So do we get depressed or we start talking about solutions? And when we, as RI, started back in 2015, we wanted to identify places that have the potential and that have the capability and that have the conditions to turn things around. And those conditions could be where there's more likelihood in political terms. So the political environment is more favorable for organizations and movements to create those changes. And also areas that were in most need, but that could also have that potential to change the direction of things. And if we talk about carbon sequestration and we look at the tropics, it's obvious that we're able to sequester more carbon in tropical areas. Their canopy, the abundance of flora that makes it more of a sponge and makes the photosynthesis process more rapid, faster. There's also areas in so much need, like for instance, the area of Mexico, northern Mexico, central Mexico, and South USA. These are semi-arid, arid dryland areas, overgrazed, where there's no life in that soil anymore. So these are the areas that have to be a priority in terms of changing things around. So, as I mentioned before, Bioorgánica is a ranch school out in San Miguel de Allende, and we are located in a dry, semi-arid area. Any idea of how much rain we get here a year?
Sí, entre 400 y 600 milímetros.
Okay. En inglés.
Between 450 and 600 millimeters per year.
If we're lucky. If we're lucky, in lucky years, right?
Sí.
Because in the past 2 or 3 years, we've been getting 350, 380.
We got a lot this year.
Este año.
Solamente este año.
Sí. But it seems that we're getting less and less rain. That's something that our friend Dylan Terrell from Caminos de Agua usually talks to us about, also the cuenca, and how the cuencas and the walls and the water sources and the water table, it's getting deeper and deeper. So why am I saying that San Miguel seemed like a good opportunity? On the one hand, for what I mentioned before, this idea of regenerating dryland areas. 60% of Mexico is actually dryland, so it gets this or even less. In Chihuahua, in the Sonora deserts, they 200, 250 millimeters per year. In southern the US, in parts of Texas, in parts of New Mexico, even less. So how can you actually grow food there, regenerate the soil, and also have a source of income? I mean, in Guanajuato, in the case of Guanajuato, this is one of the states that expels the most population, not just to the US, of course to the US, but also internally, domestically, to Mexico City, from rural San Miguel to San Miguel de Allende, to Guanajuato, to Monterrey, to Guadalajara, to Querétaro, to growing areas and growing populations. So, if I can share this. About 3 years ago, and I'm not going to, lie, because I got Ada here, who also was part of this whole movement, and Gina as well. But about 4 years ago, a delegation from Bioorgánica went to a rancho called Hacienda Samarripa, which is about 2.5 hours away from here. And in that ranch, a group of farmers had been developing a method to create forage out of agave leaves. Again, if this is a degraded area, that place is like the surface of the moon. It's like nothing. You're like, how anything grows, how anything lives here. When you're driving there, it's just, dust and, well, what do we see here around April, May, sort of, right? So it's kind of amazing, because you get to the ranch, and this is a very large ranch, which they had inherited from their father, who had bulls. And then all of a sudden there's all this, like, it's green, there's some vegetation, there's mesquite trees, there's agaves, there's animals. And you're like, wow, so how are you doing that? And so there are three brothers that are kind of like this like ingenious civil engineers. And so they developed a way to use what they had in order to create food. And what they had wasn't much. They had agave trees, they had mesquite trees. Sounds familiar? So what are we gonna do with all these agaves? What are we gonna do with all these mesquite trees? Well, we gotta find a way to feed this to our animals. One, because if we want to feed them alfalfa, or we want to feed them corn, or we want to feed them other type of forage, A, super expensive. B, not sustainable. C, can you imagine the water footprint of growing alfalfa in a place where you only have 300 millimeters of rain a year? These guys were like, well, let's take some agave leaves, let's chop them and see if they eat it. It wasn't happening. It wasn't happening at first. But then they realized that they had to find a way to make it more palatable, more tasty for the animals. So, just research and try and error, that kind of how things happen. They decided, well, let's ferment some of those agave leaves and see what happens. So they put the bucket, they put some of the chopped agave leaves, they cover the bucket so that no oxygen, no air could get in. 3 months, voila! It was like chucrut. Have you ever tried the chucrut? Right? So these guys were like, okay, let's give them to the animals. And all of a sudden the animals are eating sheep and goats. That's what they have. So what they had done is, that by fermenting the agave leaves, they had created candy. They had taken out all of the saponins, which are the ones that burns the digestive system from the animals. And they had created a low-cost, affordable, nutritious food for the animals. Of course, it wasn't as nutritious as giving them, alfalfa, or as giving them other types of food. Or if you had a bountiful of, grass that they could eat, it's not the same. So again, they were experimenting with other ways to add a nutrition to this food. So again, they had the mesquite. They took the mesquite pods, the beans. They made a mesquite flour, which we eat as well, of course, and it's pretty delicious. And they mix it with the agave fermented leaves. And they started figuring out ways to feed their animals with this low-income food. So 3.5 years ago, a delegation from the Villa Orgánica Ranch goes there. And again, just like the Center for Global Justice, we're always struggling for money. It's also very expensive for us to buy alfalfa, to buy grain, to feed our animals. If you've been to the ranch lately, you'll see we have more and more animals. So we had to find an alternative. We had to find a solution. We started talking to these guys and we're like, well, we're ready to start testing. We're ready to do labs, and we're ready to do areas or plots of land where we can do trials of how to grow agave and grow also wherever there were mesquites or plant mesquites in order to be able to feed our animals. So what I'm going to show you, hang on. You follow me here? Nobody's falling asleep? What about those guys on the, why can't I show this screen? How is everyone on the Zoom?
Okay.
How is everyone doing? Everyone, are they okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're gonna share this again. Hang on, you guys. Can you see this? Yeah, you can also see my conversations with Paco, which is okay. I'm gonna make this larger and expandir, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Ahí está. Okay. So this is very short and this is very obvious for you guys, but I'm just going to show some of this so then we can then have some time for conversations, because I think we're right on time. Okay, you guys, everybody knows that Mexico is part of North America since we all live here and we know our geography, 101 basics. That's the surface area for Mexico. It's the 14th biggest country in the world. It's the 11th biggest in terms of population in the world. And, our GDP is not bad. We're number 15th in terms of economy in the world. A different thing is how we distribute that money, right? We're not gonna get there, but it's a country that has a lot of opportunities and power and potential, and politically, which is another strategic thing which we saw about where to start. Chickens coming out of my computer. Sounds like chickens. In political terms, we realized that actually for us, the political momentum now for the past 6 years has been favorable for our work as being this one of the main areas for launching this project. So, in terms of nature, it's one of the 17th mega diverse countries in the world. Its center of origin, of course, of what? What comes to mind first in terms of food when we think about Mexico and food? There you go. Corn, avocado, cacao. Okay, so this is what we were talking before, right? The dryland surface area of the national territory is about 65%. So if you've flown from the States to Mexico, what you see behind you for at least half of the flight, right, color café. Different types of dryland with different surfaces, which are, that's the percentage in terms of the national territory. But as we said before, the total territory of drylands in hectares is 125,303, which accounts for 64.8%. Why is that important? We're not talking about a solution just for the area of San Miguel or the area of Guanajuato. When we talk about this project, the Billion Agave project, we're thinking about it at a national scale, where, of course, you have to pair it. No, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We know that. You have to pair it with the types of trees, with the type of vegetation that already exists there. So we have 3 areas of implementation right now, which I'm going to show you, that are kind of different in terms of how we implement it, because we got one area in the Yucatan, specifically Merida and surrounding areas, another one in Oaxaca, in northern Oaxaca, very close to the state of Puebla, where we've already launched this project with Jesus Leon Santos, who's a Goldman Environmental Prize winner, and has a great group there called SEDICAM, and has been doing reforestation there for the past 30 years. And we have another reforestation area or Billion Agave project area in San Miguel de Allende and surrounding communities. So really fast, let's go through this. Okay. Important too, there's about 273 types of agaves all over the world. Out of those 273 types, 223 types are actually native to Mexico. So we could even go as far as saying that Mexico is center of origin for agaves. Okay, so you've all are familiar, I bet, with the agave that we, produces mezcal and the agave that produces tequila. But there's also, as I was saying before, multiple uses for agaves. If it will let me, we'll continue. Me parece que quizás es mejor que lo compartas tú, Roberto, ¿no?
Sure. Make it bigger.
No, para que se... Ahí va. Yeah, it's not. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the magic about the agave is, as you know, agaves are plants that require almost no irrigation. You've seen all these monsters, these dinosaurs growing out in rural areas and even here in San Miguel. And they are very efficient times in terms of use of water. We're talking about alfalfa and how alfalfa has this ridiculous amount of water that it needs in order to thrive and in order to survive. The agave plants have different types of metabolism, but agave plants have C3 and C4 metabolic pathways, which means that basically what they do is during the day they don't metabolize. So during the day they don't do photosynthesis. During the day, what happens is that if you look at an agave leaf closely, they have like these small stomatas or small kind of like tiny holes, if you wish. And what they do is during the day, those opening in the leaves, they close them. So what they do is that they don't evaporate and they don't lose as much water, especially in very hot areas like San Miguel and the rest of the semi-desert. And during the night, what they do is they open up and get everything ready to start photosynthesis at dawn. So during the day they close, during the night they open, and during the most efficient times to do photosynthesis, which is dawn, that's what the agave does. And so it doesn't evaporate and it doesn't lose any water. That's why basically you don't need to water or irrigate agaves at all. So these are some of the many uses of agave that we know of. Everyone who has seen an agave quiote, an agave flowering or in bloom there in the middle, we've all seen it here at the landscape. Basically, it depends on the type or variety of agave, but it blooms either at year 8 or 9 or 10. And once the agave blooms, that's the death of the agave, which is beautiful, but it's like the biggest sacrifice that this plant does. It looks so beautiful when you see one of them, but at the same time, you know that they're dying. So the next process is castration. That's how it's called, right? I didn't make that up. So what you do once it blooms, you castrate the flower and it starts oozing. So the center of the agave oozes, and pulque comes from there, right? If anybody wants to see castration, all right, from the agave, there's a castration happening at the Bioorganico Ranch on Saturday, so you're very well all invited. Don't be afraid, you guys. You should come and see. So as you can see, these are some of the many uses of the agave. As I mentioned before, forage. So what we started doing at the ranch for the past 3 years is putting all the agave leaves finely chopped. We pass them through, how do you say, a grinder? Thank you. And then you finally chop them and you put them, it could be like 20 little buckets like those, very well closed. It could be larger buckets. We put mesquite flour from mesquite pods inside that. We leave them for about 1 to 3 months. When they are ready fermented, they're like candy for the animals. And it has a shelf life of about 3 years. So you can actually store them and continue to feed it to the animals. Of course, we do that more during the dry season, which as we know is 8 months a year here. But right now there's grass and we do holistic grazing at the ranch. So we have these corrals with electric fences and we just move the animals so they're able to be very efficient in the way that they feed themselves, but also the way they regenerate the soil by walking and shitting on the ground. Sorry. So there's forage as one of the byproducts of the feeding that to the shed, but it goes come on, chickens. There you go. There's fiber. I mean, that agave has plenty of fiber, which is really good for your guts and for your digestive health. Inulin, again, that's one of the byproducts of the agave. Usually, when we think about inulin, we think about chicory. That's the main source of inulin. But there's actually very good human quality inulin. And the inulin, what it does, if you just put 2 spoons in your smoothie or warm water or whatever you like to drink, no wine, don't mix it with alcoholic beverages. But in the morning, if you start it like that, it really coats your intestines. It's really good as a probiotic as well. So there's a lot of research and development that Bioorgánica and Regeneration International has been doing around inulin. It's one of the next superfoods for sure, and you've probably seen it already at shelves. And that's from, plants that grow here. So that's the beauty of this project is, you got these plants that grow here that don't need irrigation, that are native to these areas, and that produce so many things. Bioenergy as well, of course. There's people that are actually using agave as biofuel, mainly in Australia, but here as well. Carbon credits, because it's a whole system of reforestation. So basically, depending on the area where you already have mesquite trees or other type of canopy, if you're cultivating agaves, there's a whole system that Regeneration International is developing for carbon credits, but it's not your typical carbon credits. We can talk about that whenever you want, but this is the idea of not thinking about it more as ecosystem payment services, paying back to all these rural communities that have been guardians and have been being the guardians of the lands and of the environment for so many years. So this system also is available for carbon credits. Agaves didn't qualify before as a plant susceptible to get carbon credits. We've been pushing and influencing public policy again, because the government has been good in terms of giving us the space to do that, so that agave actually is able to get carbon credits as well. We're almost done, you guys, and then we can continue with comments and questions. Sorry, the video distillates. We talk about, castration. There's a pulque process, but also once the agave finishes its life, you take out the part of the piña, and you can either make tequila or mezcal. We don't really use the Weber or the blue agave, which is the tequilana, because we've realized that so much of what is happening in Jalisco and other places shows that instead of greening the land, what these processes are doing is created a green desert. So when you drive down Jalisco, that's which it's doesn't go with the principles of biodiversity that regeneration embraces. So 3 implementation centers so far: Guanajuato, Oaxaca, and Yucatan. Each of them with its own distinctive plantation patterns, the companion trees. And respecting the specificity of every location. So I just wanted, this could be for 4 hours, but really I just wanted to bring together this idea of what we're doing. What we're doing in terms of the movement, but also in terms of some of the solutions that we are seeing and implementing on the ground. So I'm gonna shut up. And I'm going to, maybe engage in a conversation with people here if you have time, or if not, I would like to invite you to come to the Bioorgánica Ranch, not just for the castration, but also for other events that we're going to have there. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your patience, because I know we had some technical issues. And I'm looking forward to continue this.
You have time?
I do.
I have a
Sure.
Porfa, Julie.
Bueno,
Sí.
I am very familiar with the campo here in this area. And I admire what the organic is doing, but it's this projection that you do is affecting the understanding of Mexicans of what it is to do this because I'm familiar with places that I go, and I have an organization that promotes these kinds of things, but people are just not going to do any changes. I invited a couple of people to go to Cuba, paid by my foundation, to see how Cubans are doing organic agriculture. And then I also invited them to go to Via Organic. But they feel that no, we cannot do that. We have to have agaves and honey and how can you change that mentality? Because this is fabulous, but if it's not affecting the Mexican working class to the bottom up, what would this?
And understood, and I agree. And part of that has to do with community work. So if you're not doing community work and talking to, whether you're working with a ejido, whether you're working in communal land, we've done this whole process also at that. But I think that the hardest pattern to change the pattern right here, right? The mental one. And it's been a whole process of showing results. And so what do we do in many cases, in particular for the agave project, we bring people from communities to come to the ranch so they can see with their own eyes how animals are eating that. And then they can see how their expenses will decrease by choosing this type of food. So at first, for instance, Julie, nobody wanted to try the agave fermentado. You know why? Because they would say, entripa los animales. So it gives them like, they're going to start having all these issues, right? They're not going to be able to digest and they're going to eventually die. Which, if you fed them the whole agave without it being fermented, of course. But then what we started doing was bringing buckets of fermented food to each community. And once they started seeing with their own eyes that this could happen, that, you know, you could actually feed animals and lower your costs, A, and B, that you could eventually get carbon credits, which is important also. You need to talk about, you know, people need to eat and make money. And C, that you could actually, you know, implement it with something that you had in hand. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. It started becoming more and more, I don't know if popular is the word, but at least people started embracing it and putting it into practice. And when it comes down to like larger organizations, so we have a group of pulqueros from Tlaxcala and from Hidalgo who want to and are already implementing this. So maybe, you know, another solution, another angle is go talk to the ones that are already organized, that have a strong movement, you know, and that are already doing other things. And when they come to the ranch again and they see it with their own eyes, it makes a difference. Pero sí, es un problema lo que me dices, claro. Señor.
On the United States, there's something called silage, which is where you take alfalfa, we cover it in plastic, cover it and let it ferment. It makes it easier for the cattle to digest. It's also warm, so it's one of the
Exactly.
You're doing the same thing there. So what concerns me is the sugar.
Uh-huh.
Put a huge amount of sugar in the mixture. I'm not sure if that's good for the animal. I mean, probably they don't eat sugar.
Well, the thing is, the sugar, it's inulin, actually. That's the type of sugar that the agave has. So it's a healthy sugar, if you want. I understand the concern about, you know.
What kind of sugar?
Inulin.
Oh, that inulin, I've heard of inulin before.
Right. But no, but that's a very valid, it's a very valid concern. Otherwise you could have, you know, animals with diabetes all over the place. Exactly. But this is inulin, so that's a very, you know, it's not as refined sugar, white sugar that you will think. It's actually a good probiotic, and it's sweet, of course, and that's what it makes this palatable taste for the animals. But it doesn't, you know, increase the risk of diabetes. Yeah. But good call. Yeah.
So the fermentation doesn't ferment the sugar into something, it leaves the sugar?
Well, because it ferments, it naturally adds sugar, but the sugar that it has is inulin, so it's not a refined sugar of sorts as if you were actually, you know, putting alcohol or anything like that.
Because like with alcohol, you're converting the sugar to
Right.
alcohol. This is
So there's
putting
no
yeast
yeast
in.
involved.
Uh-huh.
The yeast is what converts the sugar to the alcohol.
Oh, that's true.
There's no yeast.
Otherwise, oh, sorry. Yeah.
Is that happy?
But yeah, I've seen, animals eating, really highly fermented things. And then, how you see deer eating apples and then, Yeah.
In this area in Baja California, vineyards become very popular. Again, producing wine, and of course that takes an enormous amount of water out of the ground. And how in the world are you ever going to convince those people to give up their vineyards that become so popular, and they're doing tourist trips to the vineyard now and all that kind of thing? So you get a challenging issue.
It's in Baja, but it's starting here as well. Have you seen all the vineyards? Like more and more, before we had what, 3, 4, and then all of a sudden there's an explosion, mainly because a lot of the mayors have interest in that and have their own vineyards, and it is definitely a tough issue. But then I guess if you show an alternative, also again, which could be dangerous, because a lot of people are into this idea of producing mezcal, right? Or destilados de agave, which mezcal, as you know now, it's super popular. Back in the day, nobody wanted to drink mezcal because it was, like a lower class kind of drink. And then all of a sudden it became hip. So you're right. But I think that at some point when they start realizing that they can no longer produce like that, they're going to have to find an alternative. And if you create some sort of economic viability and income for that.
Could you talk a little bit about October 16th? You said.
Yes. So there's World Food Day is October the 16th. And what happens usually is that between now, which is New York City Food Week right now, Climate and Food Week right now, and the Conference of the Parties, beginning of December, the big agendas in the world start talking about food. And when I say the big agendas, I also talk about the agendas that are behind organizing UN, behind organizing World Food Day. So it's our usual suspects, so Bayer, Cargill, Pioneer, and now the other corporations that are claiming the term regenerative, Danone, Unilever, Bimbo, Coca-Cola, Pepsi. So more and more and more, you're seeing that they are, starting to talk that talk. Nobody walk the walk. They're never going to do that. But so what they do is they start saying how great they are, at producing food, how great they are at being able to supply for food for this, growing population. So what we do is we say, wait, those are not the ones producing food. The ones producing food is the 70, it's the farmers that have almost no land and produce 70% of the food that we eat. So with that idea, 3 years ago, we said, why don't we actually start showing the ones that do produce the food, that are the ones that put the food in our plates, but are also the ones that are fighting and that are succeeding in this fight against the system with innovative processes. So we started in Oceania, in Australia, and we ended in Alaska in one whole day around the globe of people discussing food sovereignty, food production, public policies that were, beneficial or damaging for food production, and what we can do to unite, and what were the common challenges that these people were facing. So, clearly the Australians, the ones in Africa, the ones in Europe, the ones in Latin America, the ones in North America, all facing the same challenges. So we realized, this is what we should do. We should actually have do this every year so that people can talk and discuss and openly have a space where they can communicate what their challenges are and what they're doing to overcome those challenges, and maybe even make connections, because that's part of what we do as Regeneration International. We create those bridges of, educations, translations, practices, and also an idea of a place where you could have, you know, a common language, but also a common ground to be able to discuss all these problems together. Kind of like a cabinet of like a psychological, you know, one day of sharing issues and sharing alternatives and communicate and coordinate. So it's a free event. It's online and it happens on October the 16th. And then we want to have people also, even from San Miguel, coming in December to the ranch to think more together about this idea of a bio-district, a bio-region.
So it's out in the organic.
The 16th is online, and then December is going to be at Bioorgánica. So we'll let you know in advance about the date, and so you know, if some of you have a car, otherwise we can find a van and we can bring people over there. We think it would be important for you also to see the whole agave project in practice.
How much land does somebody need to do this
For
for themselves?
the agave project, you mean? Anywhere from a hectare to as many hectares as you want. But the idea is, if you're going to do this in a biodiverse way, you want to plant between 2,000, 2,500 max agaves per hectare. But there's people that are doing this in plots of like, you know, 1 hectare in Sosnava, 2 hectares. In the case of Bioorgánica, we have different plots with different densities. But all in all, we got about 15 hectares planted. And with 1 hectare, I mean, the idea is also to plant it with different ages. So you plant agave that has, you know, year 1, year 3, because you want to have, you know, it rotates by the time that, you know, that it flowers, and then, you know, eventually year 8 or year 10, that's your harvest. So then you rotate the harvest, and the beauty about the agave, it's also, you've ever seen how it has all those hijuelos around them? It's got these runners, right? And it's all the babies are right there. So by year 1, 1 agave plant can create or generate 3 hijuelos or 3 babies. And it's actually good for you to take the baby away from the mom. It's sucking all the energy from the mom. It doesn't happen until they are 18 or 45 in the case of humans, but by year 1, they can actually go and live by themselves. So you actually are creating your own nursery as well.
Have you tried to reach the federal programs? I mean, the huge federal programs produciendo para el bienestar.
Yeah, and Sembrando Vida, exacto. Well, Guanajuato State did not qualify for Sembrando Vida. So Guanajuato State is not part of the Sembrando Vida program, but we have really good relationships, especially with Victor Suarez and some of the other people. But anyway, it would be good, if possible, if I could share these invitations with you, Liz, and this news. I don't know if, you know, the Agroecology Congress in November is very interesting, the People's Food Summit, and this idea of creating a bio-district. I think that it's super important that we start thinking and discussing how can we, and what you were mentioning before, how can San Miguel be a different place, but really be a different place? I mean, not this idea of this tourism that it's so, you know, I don't even have a word. I mean, I do have words, but I don't want to say them publicly about what I think about this type of tourism. But we need to start thinking about a tourism that has a different sort of impact, that actually has no impact on the territory, a cleaner type of tourism. San Miguel has all the conditions to be that, to become that different place where we have traditions, we have culture, we have food, and we still have biodiversity, but not for much longer. But how can we change things around so that we make a real green San Miguel? So I would like to invite you to those conversations in December. I think we all have a responsibility because this is the place where we live, the place that we love, where we're involved.
The chickens here in Mexico, we see them out the huge trucks and the trailers
Uh-huh.
and all the chickens in them. I know that they have a really negative impact
Yeah.
on the environment and the resources that they take up. And I know now they're beginning to genetically produce in laboratories the equivalent of what chicken is. I don't want to talk anybody out of their chicken dinner, but apparently this could be done on an industrial scale, and it would solve a lot of problems that the chickens are really causing overall environment. So we're dealing with a science issue, a technology issue, and a cultural issue at the same time.
Exactly.
You've got the confluence of all these things
Exactly, because
happening.
yeah.
But it looked like an exciting possibilities that genetically you can produce the chicken.
There's a lot of that. I mean, I clearly understand the issue of Bachoco or other, chicken companies.
Yeah.
Again, I believe that chicken production can be done well and without, and even at a larger scale.
Yeah.
We believe in this idea of three range chickens. So chickens are jungle animals. That's how they work. If you go to any place, you won't see chickens inside a small house. They're up in the trees, and they can grow in a way that it's actually not permissive, not bad for the environment. I personally have an issue with synthetic meat and all type of symbio, but I think that one of the main issues for me is the cultural and economic part of it, which is thinking about food without farmers.
Yeah.
The idea of, what are farmers going to do that have traditionally raised chickens?
And we run into issues with genetically modified foods.
Exactly.
Different things like that.
Exactly.
So you have a whole slew of issues, but the possibilities are enormous. And the reduction of stress on the environment and the climate would be one of the benefits. On the other hand, are we all going to become mutants if we're eating this chicken?
Exactly.
Laboratory produced.
Yeah.
Got those issues.
Yeah.
We see how difficult it is in the world today, convincing people to get their vaccination shot. There, it becomes a political issue.
Yeah.
Should I get the vaccination or should I not get the vaccination? So you have the same things that will creep up.
No, it's definitely a very complex issue. It has all these different layers of complexity, and you could have arguments on both sides.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Makes life interesting.
Exactly. Muy bien. Bueno, pues, muchas gracias. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at the ranch and here in our time.